The Battle of the Atlantic was the quest to keep Britain connected to America in World War II. You see, by 1940, the entirety of Western Europe was under control by the Nazis or their allies. Britain stood alone as the sole European ally. This, of course, came with the fact that Britain could no longer be supplied by their allies in Europe. All of their supplies had to come from their closest ally, which was thousands of miles away, the United States of America. This battle had three objectives: blockading the Axis, secure Allied movements and convoys in the Atlantic, and control the Atlantic to be able to project warfare from it. The first objective was completed relatively easily, but it did not have much of an effect, as they had strong naval power outside of the Atlantic and they had access to many overland routes. The second objective was the hardest: securing convoy movements. Despite the Kriegsmarine's relatively weak surface fleet, their U-boat submarines were numerous and devastating. They could sink anything with no notice, and this threat was what the Allies mainly focused on. This is also the main focus of this work. The third and last objective was not in the limelight until D-Day, when the Allies needed to project amphibious warfare onto the coasts of Normandy. Fortunately, Objective 2 was largely complete by then, making it trivial to complete the third objective. First, we'll speak about the U-boat submarines. They were largely introduced after June 1940 and the fall of France. Before this, they mainly used smaller surface ships to harass Allied shipping. The fall of France was key for the Kriegsmarine, as these new key ports were in strategic places and were outside of the British blockades. It also signaled the moment where Britain lost its European connections, leading the Nazis to begin targeting the British convoys. After some raiding of the convoys, the Germans learned that the U-boats were extremely effective. Eventually, the U-boats would evolve into the main threat in the Atlantic. Secondly, we'll now look at a brief chronological overview of the battle. The first use of U-boats was on September 1st, 1939, the first day of the war. At the time, surface ships were still mainly used and were devastating to the Allied Navy. Up to the fall of France, Germany was hugely successful with their surface ship campaign. Around this time, Lend-Lease aid from the US began to supply Britain with more ships. Around the dawn of 41, the Germans began to use tactics combining the power of many different vessels, such as the Wolfpack tactics of the U-boats, and sometimes even combined attacks using surface ships, submarines, and airplanes. These pack tactics were notably extremely effective. March and April 1941 were the months with the most losses, with 43 ships sunk on just the 27th and 28th of March alone. Meanwhile, May 1941 was a huge achievement for the Allies. They had sunk the Bismarck, the largest and most formidable German ship. This was a huge blow to Germany's surface fleet, but it did nothing about the emerging U-boat threat. At this time, U-boats began to see more and more prolific use. At this time, the United States was not at war with Germany. Karl Dönitz, an admiral of the Kriegsmarine, did not want any ships to directly attack US ships, as not to provoke war. However, U-boat U-652 did that anyway, prompting Roosevelt to order strict official defense of any convoys by the US Navy. After the US entry into the war, the U-boats began to be dispatched much closer to US waters. Shortly after this, the strengthening American military began to slow down German advances, however. Dönitz ordered his fleet back into the North Atlantic, but increased convoy security allowed convoys to reliably reach North Africa and the Soviet Union. At this point, many ships were still sunk, so the US began the Liberty warship program. These mass-produced ships were ugly and inferior, but could be mass-produced extremely efficiently. At this point, Allied convoy protection had also begun to fend off nearly all surface ship attacks on their convoys. This led Hitler to liquidate the surface ship fleet in 1943, to focus his production on the more successful U-boat program. The last German surface ship, Scharnhorst, was lost in September 1943, ending the surface fleet of Nazi Germany. Leading into 44, the Allies had significantly eaten away at the success of the U-boat program. U-boat U-505 was captured on June 4th, 1944, which was major because it had the naval code books on board. This allowed the Americans to break the naval codes, allowing them to hunt down the U-boat fleet far more efficiently. By now, the battle was effectively won, though it did not officially end until the surrender of Germany 11 months later. Now, we're going to go into two aforementioned projects that did a lot to win the battle: Enigma Decryption and the Liberty Warship Program. Firstly, the Enigma Decryption Program. This had its roots all the way back in 1928, when the Poles began to have interest in cracking the Enigma codes. No other country had any interest in cracking the new codes at the time. Poland's cryptology service, the Bureau Schiffrau, sorry for the pronunciation, opened an advanced cryptology class in 1929. 3 students emerged as leaders in the class, one of them being Marian Rejewski. The 3 were hired by the Bureau and given the task of reconstructing the Enigma. Rejewski was helped by a French, who had obtained secret Enigma documents from a German civil servant codenamed Asche. The French and British had given up using them, but they offered them to Allied countries. Rejewski and co. quickly took in the information. With the help of these materials, Rejewski and co. was able to reconstruct the Enigma around the early 30s. During the rise of Hitler, they could read most Enigma messages, but it was once again rendered impenetrable after the codes were upgraded in 1938. The Polish even got possession of an Enigma at the time, as the Germans tried to pass it through Polish customs. Of course, all the research stopped after the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the full collapse of the Polish nation. The Allies rescued many of the Polish codebreakers, bringing them to safety in France and later Britain. In the end, they ended up at the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park. The computers at Bletchley ran on bombs made by Turing, which were initially successful at reading codes but began to fall off in usefulness later into the war, as Germany upgraded its encryption. In 1943, the British built the Colossus, a vacuum tube computer that was extremely efficient at decrypting signals. It could run 5,000 calculations per second. With 10 running around the clock, they were able to decrypt 2,000 messages per day. Decrypting these messages was important. If the Allies had the secret information, they could learn of impending attacks or U-boat positioning before the fact. This allowed the Allies to move more of their convoys out of the way, allowing more cargo to reach Europe. Ironically, the Germans did not realize the power of computers, unlike the British. A scientist named Konrad Zuse made many different computer prototypes, which were successful. However, the Nazis rejected the machine. This was a fatal error, as Zuse's computer was likely fast enough to decrypt all Allied codes and strengthen the existing Enigma codes significantly. Moving on to the Liberty ships, these were ships based off a 1879 British design called the Tramp Streamer. They were extremely ugly, as the British prioritized function over form. The most major change was that it was welded, not riveted, making it much quicker to manufacture, but much less durable in the long run. However, the British didn't care about durability, as they reasoned that it must have already been sunk by the time the welding joints failed. The ships also used steam engines, as they needed to save the diesel engines to power the land vehicles of war, such as tanks and jeeps. The stats of the ship can be seen on screen right now. There was a race between American shipyards to see who could build a Liberty the fastest. The record was 4 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes from the laying of the keel to it sailing out of harbor. However, the average was a much slower 27 days to build and 14 days to kit out. The crew of a Liberty was 50 men, including 12 officers. They had a 10 to 20 sailor armed guard, which manned a 5-inch aft gun and 10 20mm anti-aircraft guns on the ships. These ships were very lightly armed, with only 1 kill ever recorded. In total, 2,700 Liberties were built. The program was regarded as a success and played a huge role in the battle. Only 200 Liberties were lost before the end of the war, mostly from torpedoes. Despite the battle mostly being told from a military overview perspective, there are, of course, individual stories in the battle. There's a story from Basil D. Izzy, a seaman second class in the Navy. He was the armed guard in the SS Zandam. The ship was hit by 2 torpedoes sent by U-174, sinking it. Some scrambled into the lifeboats, with many, including Izzy, being forced to jump into the water. Izzy clung onto some wreckage overnight until a raft rescued him the next morning, a raft he would spend 83 days on. They had 16 days of food, which soon ran out. On day 20, they saw 2 ships, both of which could not notice them. On the 66th day, one of the sailors died after becoming extremely sick. A gunnery officer also got sick shortly after and died on day 76. On day 82, 2 airplanes came, which were both too high or too far to notice them. However, on the 83rd day, a destroyer noticed them at 5,000 yards, who rescued them. Izzy would then spend some time in hospital. The full details of his interview can be found in the databases of the Naval History and Heritage Command. In the end, the battle was a devastating one, but it was won, for good.